Welcome to this video presentation of NATO Logistic Planning Conferences. After this presentation, you should be able to summarize the different logistic planning conferences and explain the output of each conference. Logistic standards and doctrine are the key elements of logistic planning. They provide the common basis for operational planning activities of NATO and national logistic planners. They are the means to ensure that national plans support NATO objectives and alliance operations and missions. Some of the planning documents are depicted on the slide. Notice that the BISAC Allied Joint Operational Guidelines for Logistics 2013 expired when the new AGP4 Doctrine for Logistics was ratified in December 2019. But it's still a useful planning tool for operational logistics. The purpose of Phase 1 situational awareness is to develop and maintain a level understanding to support operational assessments and the provision of operational level advice and decision-making to secure during the planning for and conduct of operations. The Joint Force Command staff will develop an initial system perspective of the area of interest by identifying basic logistic characteristics related to PMEC: political, military, economical, social, infrastructure, and information. The designated Joint Force Command staff will support the Strategic Operations Planning Group at SHAPE in this phase, since the Joint Operational Planning Group not yet has been activated. The Joint Force Command staff will collect and analyze the existing reference information from the Joint Force Command license in the Strategic Operations Planning Group in order to build situational awareness, submit requests for information when information is unknown, and continue to update the baseline data as new information becomes available. The review of the basic logistic reference information is categorized according to PMEC: political, military, economical, social, infrastructure, and information. And review the logistic reference information might include, at a minimum, the Joint Force Command staff will focus on the infrastructure, the basic facilities services, and installations needed for the functioning of a community, organization, or society. This includes logistical communications and transport, infrastructure, schools, hospitals, water and power distribution, sewage, irrigation, geography, and so on. The logistical outcome in this phase is the initial logistic estimate of the crisis area, the area of interest. During Phase 2, the Joint Operations Planning Group is activated. The logistic planners in this phase are responsible for the logistic analysis and evaluation of the military response options, mainly identifying the requirements in the logistic functional areas: supply, movement and transportation, medical, and so on. Logistic outcome in this phase: logistic estimate of the crisis area, area of interest. The purpose of this phase is to identify the logistic requirements to support the development of each military response options. The planners will need to determine the overall logistic support requirements for an operation in order to prepare a coherent plan. NATO Logistic Planning Conferences is the principal tool by which planning is coordinated and transparency achieved. All planning conferences are divided into 3 subjects: logistics, movement and transportation, and medical. The responsibility for the planning process is shared by Allied Command Operations, including Joint Force Command and the troop contributing nations. The type of planning, example advanced planning to develop courses of actions, or crisis response planning, dictates the timing and frequency of conferences. We have previously stated that the NATO Logistic Planning Conferences are the hub in which planning is coordinated and transparency is achieved between NATO and the troop contributing nations. The slide depicts the Logistic Planning Conferences and the operational planning process phases. Logistic planning is part of the NATO operational planning process and aims to ensure that the availability of logistic support in general. Issues such as the use of multinational logistics, the role of the host nation, and coordination with international organizations and non-governmental organizations are considered. Logistic support guidelines are produced and includes considerations such as the geography of the theater and the political and military situation. The outcome of logistic planning is an overall concept of support detailed in the supporting annexes of the concept of operations and O-plan. Movement planning. The development of movement plans in support of NATO operations will be an iterative process and may begin with limited military guidance or political clearance. Force planning should identify all forces needed to fulfill operational requirements that have been established in the concept of operations in order to arrange the arrival of these forces into the JOA in accordance with the Joint Force Command's Allied Disposition List and Commander's required date. The outcome of movement planning will be a multinational detailed deployment plan, coordinated and deconflicted by the Allied Movement Coordination Centre to meet operational requirements. Medical planning. It is an iterative process that shifts in emphasis as the operational and intelligence situation changes. The outcome of medical planning will be a plan that outlines the requirements, policies, and the support to be provided to forces throughout all phases of an operation. The plan must provide medical capabilities throughout the force structure, which are in balance with the size of the deployed force and the assessed risk. The achievement of this aim requires availability and coordination of a complete range of military medical skills, equipment, and supplies in the JOA. For more information, see the medical support presentation. The initial planning conference is an Allied Command Operations level conference involving nations and the Joint Force Command. The initial planning conference is usually held when the CJSOR and the CONOPS have been approved. Combined Joint Statement of Requirement is the result of the NATO force generation process and consists of military capabilities and capacities that will support the mission. CONOPS clearly expresses what the commander intends to accomplish and how it will be done using the available resources. The outcome of this conference will be to enable Allied Command Operation to develop the logistic annex to the O-plan, as well as to provide nations with the information to commence national logistic planning and confirm the required force flow based on the Allied disposition list. After this stage, usually the operational liaison and reconnaissance team and/or Joint Logistic Reconnaissance Team will be released to gather unsolved information needed in the area of interest. These two teams will be explained in a later presentation. The main planning conference is conducted during Phase 4 Alpha, developing the operational plan based on minimum military requirements according to the Force Statement of Requirements. It is usually held when the first draft of the Joint Force Command O-Plan is available, including the first draft of the Force Statement of Requirements to be sourced by the NATO Force Generation process. The outcome of this conference will be that the Joint Force Command can finalize the O-Plan, develop the detailed force requirements, and issue an administrative instruction. In addition, the troop contributing nations should be able to further develop and detail national logistic plans based on the Allied disposition list and the commander's required date. The final planning conference is usually held after nations' formal commitment of forces, but before the activation order. The outcome should be a balanced and harmonized system of Allied command operations, Joint Force Command, and the national logistic plans, and that the troop contributing nations should be able to finalize the national logistic plans. The Operational Logistic Review Conference is an Allied Command Operations level conference with the involvement of the troop contributing nations and the Joint Force Command. This conference is optional and will only be held if changes in the military situation require fundamental adjustments of logistic plans, or if the identified logistic shortfalls could jeopardize the mission. The purpose of the conference is to resolve any deficiencies and to review and adjust the logistic concept of operations and/or operational logistics plans. The result of this conference should be an executable operational plan. In some cases, due to the short timelines for the execution of the operational planning process, it should be decided to skip initial, main, and final logistic planning conferences and instead call for an operational logistic review conference. Attending one of NATO's logistic conferences can be a demanding task. You need to know your national logistic concept, plans, and concerns for the upcoming operation. You need to know your nation's RFIs, to which you must find answers during the conference. Before the conference, you must clarify what your own nation is willing to take on joint logistic responsibilities or tasks, including logistic units. Most important of all, you must have clarified the authority and mandate to be able to commit on behalf of your own nation. Let's recall what we already have learned. Logistic outcome in Phase 1 is the initial logistic estimate of the crisis area, the area of interest. Logistic outcome in Phase 2 is the logistic estimate of the crisis area, area of interest. Logistic outcome in Phase 3 is the draft logistic requirements to support the development of each military response options. Logistic planning conferences are the principal tool by which planning is coordinated and transparency is achieved. All planning conferences are divided into 3 subjects: logistics, movement and transportation, and medical. The responsibility for the planning process is shared by Allied command operations, including Joint Force Command and troops contributing nations. The type of planning, for example, advanced planning to develop courses of action or crisis response planning, dictate the timing and frequency of conferences. And outcome initial planning conference. To enable Allied Command operations to develop the logistic annexes to the O-plan, provide troop contributing nations with the information to commence national logistic planning. Outcome of the main conference. Joint Force Command can finalize the O-plan, develop the detailed force requirements through the NATO force generation process. The troop contributing nations should be in a position to further develop and detail national logistic plans. Outcome of the final planning conference. A balanced and harmonized system of Allied Command operations, Joint Force Command, and the national logistic plans. The troop contributing nations should be able to finalize the national logistic plans. Logistic units under JLSG and national support elements will be deployed before the main forces to be able to support those forces in the reception, staging, and onward movement phase. We have in this presentation introduced you to the NATO Logistic Planning Conferences. Key takeaways. Planning conferences are the principal tool for operational logistic planning. The outcome of the planning conferences are the annexes to the O-plan, Annex R, Logistics, S, Movements, and QQ, Medical. Participants in the conference needs to have national authority and mandate to commit. Thank you for following this presentation.